On July 21st, 1588, 6,000 sailors aboard Queen Elizabeth's fleet were issued a daily ration of 4 ounces of triple-baked wheat biscuit, a slab engineered not to nourish the human body, but to resist decay for 2 years inside an oak hold. When you tear into a fresh loaf of bread today, you expect softness, moisture, and air. That softness is a luxury of peace to the admirals commanding the English Navy off the coast of Plymouth against the invading Spanish Armada. Soft bread was a logistical failure, a biological countdown that turned to blue mold within 48 hours of exposure to salt mist. What the fleet needed was not sustenance in any human sense, but a calcified armor of starch. They produced a slab of petrified flour so dense it could withstand a hammer blow, survive immersion in bilge water, and remain inert while cannons battered the wooden hull. How did a virtually inedible brick of petrified flour beat out gunpowder, gold, and timber to become the supreme logistical weapon of global empire? To chew this currency was an act of physical attrition against the human jaw, attempting to bite directly into a tile of dried wheat routinely shattered molars and fractured jawbones thousands of miles from the nearest surgeon. Men learned to draw their iron-handled rigging knives, smashing the slabs into jagged shards on the oak planking before dropping them into cauldrons of boiling salt water. Out of this mechanical violence came burgoo. Cooks swept the bottom of empty casks, collecting crushed flour dust, larval casings, and insect droppings, then boiled the residue into a gray paste thickened with slush. The rancid yellow tallow skimmed off boiled salt pork. It was not food in any human sense. It was an industrial lubricant designed to slide 400 calories down inflamed throats without requiring teeth to chew it. Yet while this starch fueled muscles to haul anchor chains and run out heavy iron cannons in Atlantic gales, it contained zero ascorbic acid. By the 3rd month of a blockade off Toulon or Brest, the biological engine began to disintegrate from within. Without vitamin C, the collagen-binding human tissue dissolved. Spongy gums bled over loosened teeth. Scars from wounds suffered a decade prior split open, bleeding fresh red as if inflicted yesterday. Fractured bones healed years ago quietly unknit inside the flesh. By April 1797, that cold operating equation collapsed entirely. 16 ships of the line at Spithead refused orders to put to sea, followed weeks later by the Nore fleet in the Thames estuary. The sailors were not striking for political liberty. They dragged barrels of green, worm-eaten biscuits to the gangways and dumped them into the Solent, turning black iron guns toward their own shore batteries to demand honest weight and edible rations. The rebellion brought the maritime power of Great Britain to a dead standstill. The Admiralty realized that to maintain its grip on global sea lanes, it could no longer rely on thousands of manual bakers or endure the physical friction of starving crews. It needed to strip the human element out of the food supply entirely and automate the petrified bread before the men burned the dockyards to the ground. To understand how this weapon was built, you have to stand on the muddy banks of the Thames at the Deptford Victualling Yard in 1740. The air there did not smell of a neighborhood bakery. It smelled of sulfur coal smoke, scorched grain, and wet oak. Thousands of tons of coarse wheat flour were unloaded from river barges every week, processed not by craftsmen, but by press-ganged workers laboring in 12-hour shifts under strict naval contract quotas. The primary enemy of the British Royal Navy was never just the French or Spanish fleets. The true enemy was atmospheric water. Biological rot requires moisture to feed the fungi and bacteria that decompose organic matter. If a naval biscuit contained even 6% water when loaded into the hold, it would sprout thick green mold the moment a ship crossed south of the Tropic of Cancer. So Deptford developed a process of thermal violence. Workers mixed flour and water into a thick dough with almost no hydration. They threw the mass onto heavy wooden tables where men jumped on mechanical levers called brake staffs, using their full body weight to crush the dough flat and squeeze out every microscopic pocket of trapped air. Once rolled and stamped into square slabs, the raw flour went into massive brick kilns heated by intense sea coal fires. It was baked once to cook the starch. It was baked a second time at a lower heat to draw out the interior moisture. Then it was stacked in dry rooms above the ovens for up to 10 days, subjected to a third prolonged heat cycle until the total moisture content dropped below 4%. No yeast was allowed in the dough. No butter, no sugar. Fat goes rancid in heat. Sugar absorbs humidity from the air. Yeast creates air pockets where fungi can nest and breed. Before the raw dough entered the first furnace, overseers struck each tile with a heavy iron die. the broad arrow mark of the British Crown, branding the starch as state military property alongside cannonballs, copper sheathings, and muskets. It was not food, it was ballast that bled. When the heavy wooden doors of the Deptford kiln swung open, workers raked out hundreds of thousands of stone-hard tiles. They were packed tightly into oak casks, rammed down, and sealed with boiled pitch. The biscuit emerged from the heat of Deptford locked in total darkness, ready to face its true adversary, the suffocating equatorial humidity of the West Indies. By 1756, as global territorial conflict flared from the Ohio River Valley to the tropical coasts of Bengal, the British Admiralty transformed the nation's wheat fields into an industrial weapon factory. In that single year, government naval contracts absorbed 20% of all commercial wheat harvested across England. Think about what that number actually represents. 1/5 of a sovereign nation's agricultural soil was not feeding working mothers, city breadlines, or local village bakeries. It was being requisitioned by state treasuries, hauled along rutted country roads to riverfront processing yards, crushed into dense square tiles, and locked away in oak casks. The grain was no longer food. It was caloric ammunition, quantified by tonnage, backed by state debt, and managed by naval clerks who calculated human survival with the same cold math they applied to gunflint, iron shot, and hemp rope. In the crowded, damp grain exchanges of Mark Lane in London, merchants in heavy wool coats traded futures on petrified flour with the same ruthless precision modern financiers apply to barrels of crude oil. A wet autumn in Norfolk or a cold spell in Wiltshire did not just threaten small-town bakeries with thin bread, it threatened the deployment schedule of 74-gun ships of the line. Without millions of pounds of triple-baked wheat locked in government vaults, an entire fleet sat immobilized at the dock, its sailors starving before a single canvas sail could be unfurled. If you view the modern supply chain not as a convenience, but as the remaining scaffolding of empire, subscribe to follow these investigations every week. Once those iron-hooped oak casks were lowered into the deep pitch-black belly of a warship, the biscuit entered a second, far more insidious siege. Suspended beneath the waterline in a dark space, where bilge water leaked through oak seams and heavy hull timbers groaned under the weight of iron cannons, temperature and humidity turned the ship's hold into a biological incubator. Tallow candles flickered in the heavy air, showing sweat dripping from the overhead beams onto long rows of stacked barrels. The oak casks were engineered to resist moisture, but no cooper's pitch could seal out Calandra granaria, the grain weevil. The invasion rarely began at sea. Female beetles, microscopic in size, bored into the wheat kernels while the grain was still sitting in open granaries along the Thames, long before it reached the Deptford kilns. The intense heat of triple baking killed adult insects, but microscopic eggs buried deep within the core of the unfermented dough often survived intact. They lay dormant inside the dry starch, waiting in total darkness while the ship crossed the Atlantic. When the ship breached tropical latitudes and temperatures, inside the unventilated hold surged past 90 degrees Fahrenheit. The eggs hatched. Millions of white larvae awakened inside the petrified flour. Armed with microscopic chewing mandibles, they began consuming the biscuit from the inside out, tunneling through dense walls of cooked starch and leaving behind a hollow labyrinth of fine dust, shed skins, and insect waste. When a purser cracked open a sealed cask 6 months into a Caribbean blockade, the air that billowed out into the cramped lower deck smelled of damp soil, ammonia, and biological decay. The biscuits inside, once hard enough to resist an iron hammer, were often reduced to light, fragile honeycombs of starch and living insects. Sailors sitting at low mess tables between black iron cannons developed a daily ritual of survival. Before attempting to force a piece of hardtack past their lips, they raised the tile and slammed it edge down against the thick oak planking. Thump, thump, thump. The physical impact fractured the insect-carved starch, dislodging hundreds of live black beetles and pale grubs, which tumbled out onto the grease-stained wood. The men casually swept the wriggling mass off the table onto the deck planking, picked up the remaining shards of flour and swallowed them down. It was not a choice. It was a cold survival equation. The fleet did not advance through human strength. It advanced to the rhythm of chewing larvae. Salted beef in wooden tubs turned black, slick, and toxic with bacterial sludge within 90 days of tropical exposure. Butter melted into a rancid yellow oil that sickened anyone desperate enough to swallow it. But the hardtack, even when hollowed by millions of insects and reduced to a fragile, dusty husk, retained its core carbohydrates. It delivered 400 stable, inert calories per daily ration, day after day, month after month. That petrified slab of wheat allowed the Royal Navy to execute blockades that lasted for years without returning to port. It kept gun crews standing at their stations off the coast of North America, sustained malnourished men through the suffocating heat of the Indian Ocean, and secured a financial stranglehold over the lucrative sugar islands of the West Indies. To consume this currency was an act of physical attrition against the human jaw. Attempting to bite directly into an unsoaked biscuit tile was not merely painful, it was a medical hazard. Men who tried to chew the dry starch routinely shattered their molars or fractured jawbones thousands of miles from any surgeon. The Navy provided no dining utensils suited for such stone. Men took their iron-handled rigging knives, smashed the tile into sharp fragments on the wooden deck, and dropped those jagged shards into boiling water. Out of this mechanical necessity came the staple dish of the lower deck, burgoo. A ship's cook collected the fine sweepings from the bottom of empty biscuit casks, a mixture of crushed wheat dust, larval casings, and insect droppings, and dumped them into a heavy copper cauldron of boiling seawater. To this gray paste, he added the skimmed surface grease from boiled salt pork. It was known as slush, a yellow, greasy runoff laden with brine and pig tallow. When stirred over a low coal fire, the starch and animal fat gelatinized into a thick, heavy gruel. It did not resemble human food in any civilian sense. There was no balance, no texture, no aroma of baking bread. It was an industrial lubricant for human stomach lining, engineered to slide down inflamed throats without requiring teeth to chew it. Here lay the dark paradox at the center of naval logistics. Hardtack succeeded brilliantly at keeping men alive in terms of raw thermodynamics. It delivered pure, stable carbohydrates that fueled human muscles to haul heavy anchor chains, climb yards in Atlantic gales, and run out black iron cannons in heavy seas, yet it contained zero ascorbic acid, zero vitamin C, zero living biology. The body can run on pure starch for months, but without fresh organic compounds, the biological glue that binds human tissue begins to dissolve. By the third month of a blockade off Toulon or Brest, the men eating 4 ounces of petrified flour a day were hollowed out from the inside. Gums swollen into dark, spongy masses bled at the slightest pressure, enveloping loose teeth. The body's collagen synthesis failed entirely. Scars from wounds suffered decades earlier on land opened up again, bleeding fresh red as if inflicted yesterday. Fractured bones that had healed long ago quietly broke apart inside the flesh. It was a macabre scene beneath the gun decks, men possessing the raw muscular energy to fire a cannon, yet bleeding through their pores because the imperial ration lacked a single living element. The state treated the human engine as a mechanical furnace. You fed it dry carbon, you burned the energy, and you accepted the physical decay of the container as a routine operating loss. By 1797, that cold operating equation collapsed under its own weight. In April of that year, as Britain faced the existential threat of revolutionary France, 16 ships of the line anchored at Spithead refused orders to put to sea. Weeks later, the rebellion spread to the Nore Fleet in the Thames estuary, effectively paralyzing the naval defenses of London. History books often frame mutinies around political radicalism or abstract ideas of liberty. The logbooks tell a different, far more visceral story. The sailors were not striking for democracy. They were striking against the purser's scale and the rotting bread bag. Under naval custom, pursers were allowed 2 ounces out of every pound of hardtack as a margin for leakage, an infestation, a systemic shortchanging that left sailors eating hollow husk dust, while ship officers grew wealthy selling the surplus grain back to civilian markets. When combined with casks that arrived from Deptford already green with mold, the breaking point was reached. Sailors dragged barrels of decayed, worm-eaten biscuits up from the holds and dumped them overboard into the gray waters of the Solent. They seized control of the fleet, turned black iron cannons back toward their own shore batteries, and issued a singular demand to the Admiralty: unadulterated food, honest weight, and edible rations. For weeks, the global reach of the British Empire was frozen in place, paralyzed not by enemy broadsides, but by the biological refusal of working men to be fed on petrified mold and insect dust. The crisis was eventually resolved through concessions, hangings, and raised wages, but the rebellion at Spithead sent a shockwave through the corridors of power in Whitehall. The state realized a profound vulnerability. It had perfected the physics of food preservation, but it still relied on human hands to mix dough and human jaws to endure the ration. If a crew could be driven to treason by a rotting cask of flour, then hand-baked hardtack was a liability to national security. The Admiralty reached a cold, calculated conclusion. To maintain its grip on global sea lanes, the empire could no longer depend on thousands of individual bakers and manual laborers kneading dough on riverbanks. It needed to strip the human element out of the food supply entirely. It needed to automate the petrified bread before the men who ate it burned the dockyards to the ground. In 1831, on the gravelly coastline of Hampshire, the British state built its answer to human friction. At the Royal Clarence Victualling Yard in Gosport, a civil engineer named Thomas Grant erected a sprawling brick complex driven not by wood stoves or manual brake staffs, but by high-pressure steam power. Until Grant's machinery roared to life, the production of naval hardtack was bottlenecked by human muscle. Men jumped on heavy levers, kneaded stiff paste with bare hands, and hand-cut individual tiles at rates dictated by fatigue, sweat, and physical exhaustion. Human flesh was slow, inconsistent, and prone to political disloyalty. Grant's steam engines changed the geometry of imperial supply overnight. Inside the cavernous interior of the Gosport facility, massive cast-iron rollers driven by steam pistons took tons of bone-dry flour and water, crushing the mixture under immense, relentless pressure. No human fingers touched the dough. Heavy mechanical arms folded the paste, kneaded it through a series of steel rollers, and flattened it into uniform sheets of exact millimeter thickness. The air inside Royal Clarence Yard no longer smelled of wet wheat and human sweat. It smelled of coal soot, hot engine oil, pressurized steam, and pulverized grain. At the end of the mechanical conveyor stood the cutter. A grid of hardened steel dies, powered by the continuous stroke of the steam engine, slammed down onto the moving sheet of dough. In a single punch, it stamped the broad arrow of the crown, perforated 36 steam escape holes into each square, and sliced 40 clean, identical tiles out of the gray mass. One machine did not just replace 10 men. It replaced an entire village of bakers. By 1833, the machinery at Royal Clarence Yard was turning out 110 biscuits every 60 seconds. In a single 10-hour shift, a small crew of technicians overseeing steam valves and coal hoppers produced over 20 tons of petrified starch. That was enough to feed a fleet of 5 74-gun battleships for 6 months at sea. This was not culinary progress. It was the birth of industrial food assembly, decades before Henry Ford standardized the automobile. The Admiralty had solved the problem of human variance. Every single hardtack tile coming off the Gosport assembly line possessed the exact same density, the exact same lack of moisture, and the exact same chemical stability. If a ship in the South Pacific opened a cask processed in Hampshire 18 months prior, the rations inside were identical to those loaded at Chatham or Portsmouth. Calculations became absolute. An Admiralty clerk sitting in London could calculate the precise caloric lifespan of a squadron deployed off the coast of China without taking into account the skill, health, or mood of a local shore baker. Food had become a standardized, perfectly interchangeable component of war. This mechanical output unlocked the true terrifying scale of Victorian global dominance. During the mid-19th century, British naval power expanded into every major maritime corridor on Earth, enforcing trade concessions in East Asia, patrolling the West African coast to suppress rival slavers, and mapping the frozen channels of the Arctic. None of this global projection was sustained by tactical brilliance alone. It was sustained by the steady, unyielding mechanical pulse of the steam engines at Gosport. Squadrons could now remain stationed in the Pacific or Indian Oceans for 3, 4, or 5 years at a time, receiving periodic shipments of steam-pressed starch sealed inside iron-hooped oak casks. Ships no longer needed to make frequent dangerous landfalls in foreign territories where tropical fevers killed crews faster than enemy grape shot. They could sit miles offshore in isolated blockades, holding entire empires hostage behind a wall of naval artillery, fed entirely by dry tiles manufactured months earlier in an English brick factory. The machine did not create food. It created distance. It decoupled military logistics from geography. A nation with limited agricultural territory could now project permanent force across 10,000 miles of ocean because it had mastered the industrial mass production of indestructible calories. By 145, additional automated victualling yards were constructed in Deptford and Plymouth, locking the entire British archipelago into a synchronized network of steam-driven grain conversion. Millions of pounds of wheat were fed into the mechanical maw every month, crushed, stamped, baked, and sealed into darkness. The hardtack tile had reached the absolute apex of its mechanical efficiency. It was cheap, perfectly standardized, endlessly durable, and produced at speeds that no rival power could match. It was the inert fuel of a global system that claimed a quarter of the globe. Yet, even as steam engines hammered out millions of petrified squares in the shadow of the Hampshire docks, a subtle chemical revolution was taking shape in laboratories across Europe. A new technology was emerging, one that did not rely on drying starch until it was hard as granite, but on sealing water and meat inside hermetically soldered tin plates. The age of the petrified wheat stone had reached its peak, ready to be quietly retired by a new metal cylinder that would change the architecture of war forever. That metal cylinder was the tin can patented by Peter Durand in 1810 after French confectioner Nicolas Appert discovered that boiling food inside sealed glass jars arrested biological decay. For the first time in human history, state treasuries could preserve water, beef, and vegetables without dehydrating them into stone. Yet the hardtack biscuit did not vanish overnight. It was too cheap, too reliable, and too deeply entrenched in military doctrine to be discarded by a single invention. During the American Civil War in the 1860s, Union soldiers marched through the mud of Virginia with canvas haversacks weighed down by 9 square tiles of government-issue hardtack. The men called them worm castles and tooth dullers. They soaked them in black coffee or fried them in pork bacon fat over campfires, repeating the exact same survival rituals that British sailors had performed beneath the gundeks at Plymouth 3 centuries earlier. Even in the muddy trenches of the Western Front in 1914, British and Commonwealth troops opened cardboard tins of Army Service Corps biscuits, using them as structural shims for trench walls or grinding them down to thicken thin rations. The hardtack tile was not retired because it failed. It was retired because industrial chemistry perfected its underlying principle. When you examine a modern military meal ready to eat, the vacuum-sealed foil pouch issued to infantry forces today, you are looking at the direct lineal descendant of the Deptford kiln. The packaging has shifted from pitch-sealed oak barrels to multi-layered polyethylene and aluminum foil. The grain inside is treated with chemical oxygen scavengers instead of triple baking. But the underlying doctrine is completely unchanged. The state still demands a calorie that refuses to die. It demands a ration that can sit inside a shipping container in 40-degree desert heat or sub-zero Arctic humidity for 36 months without requiring refrigeration, without succumbing to fungal spores, and without surrendering its caloric integrity. The technology evolved. The math remained identical. Look past the military depot and walk into any modern supermarket aisle today. We like to imagine that the rows of colorful cardboard boxes and plastic wrappers represent the pinnacle of civilian comfort, consumer choice, and agricultural abundance. It is an illusion. The modern processed food industry is not a civilian invention. It is the commercialized architecture of imperial naval logistics. The shelf-stable cracker sitting in a plastic sleeve on your local grocery rack relies on the exact same structural compromises engineered at the Royal Clarence Yard in 1831. The moisture content is forced down below 5%. The natural fats that give whole grain its perishable freshness are stripped away during milling, replaced by hydrogenated oils that resist oxidation and rancidity. Chemical preservatives act as modern pitch, sealing the starch off from the surrounding atmosphere. It was never designed to honor the human palate. It was engineered to survive the friction of the global supply chain. You are not buying food optimized for your biology. You are buying inert carbon optimized for a cardboard box, a wooden pallet, and an ocean shipping vessel. When state planners look at a population during a geopolitical crisis, a blockade, or a breakdown in international trade, they do not calculate fresh produce or local artisanal bread. They calculate caloric reserve. They measure tonnage, shelf life, and the precise mathematical threshold where starch prevents human rebellion. It proved that global dominion was never secured by tactical genius, but by the ruthless mathematical triumph of inert calories over biological rot. Open your own pantry cabinet tonight, stand there in the quiet light of your kitchen, and look at the dry, boxed goods lining the shelves. That vacuum-sealed pack of saltines or square flour tiles did not originate in a cozy home bakery. It originated in the coal smoke of Deptford, in the steam-driven iron presses of Gosport, and in the dark holds of 74-gun ships of the line battling across tropical ocean currents. Next time you reach into your pantry for a cracker that lasts 2 years without spoiling, remember you're not touching a snack, you are holding the dried inert descendant of a weapon that kept 6,000 men silent in the dark while an empire claimed the oceans. I'm Julian Vance. Until the next manifest is opened.